Welcome to another special episode of the Beehive. This podcast will focus on the fiduciary foundations, how smart boards lead mission-driven growth. Dedicated to empowering nonprofit leaders, executive directors, CFOs, and board members to build stronger, more sustainable organizations. I'm your host, James Brian Turico, Senior Manager from Scrub. Today, I'll be joined as well by Marta Rubin Kiesling, Managing Director at Dunleavy and Associates, and also Lawrence Christopher Royal, Director of Finance at Scrub. Together, we're diving deep into arguably the most critical aspect of an NPO success, the board's role in financial oversight, revenue generation, and overall sustainability. Did you know that according to multiple studies, inadequate financial oversight is one of the leading causes of NPO failure? It's a stark reminder of why this topic isn't just important, it's absolutely crucial for the health and longevity of your mission. So whether you're an ED executive director looking for, to better engage your board, a CFO seeking to empower your financial committee, or a board member eager to fulfill your duties effectively, this episode is for you. We're going beyond the basics to uncover how your board can truly drive financial health and growth. So welcome, Marta and Lawrence.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here, and I hope we can bring some value talking about this very timely issue, particularly in the United States now for our nonprofits.
Thank you very much, James. Always glad to talk shop about nonprofit boards and money, especially how we make the numbers meaningful and manageable for people who didn't sign up to be accountants.
Okay, let's start with the cornerstone, fiduciary responsibility. What does it truly mean for an NPO board member? Is it more than just, a legal term and a deep commitment of trust? Does it mean that you're legally and ethically obligated to act in the best financial interest of the organization, or putting the NPO's well-being above all else?
First, I want to say, I know fiduciary sounds like a word you hear from your lawyer, your accountant, or your finance committee chair, right? But the truth is, fiduciary duty is not just a legal concept. It should be a mindset across the board. It's the heart of how boards lead, especially in today's complex fundraising environment.
Yeah, and I think that it's one of the areas that's not paid much attention to on boards in real life as they're going about their day-to-day governance work in their annual and quarterly meetings or however often they meet. I don't often hear them talking about the fiduciary duty or how the work they're doing ties into those fiduciary responsibilities. Um, we do at Dunleavy quite a bit of governance training because that helps boards understand how the specific fiduciary obligations play out in real life. It also helps the boards understand what their role is as opposed to the staff role, the executive, the CEO or executive director, and the rest of the C-suite and staff.
I agree, Martha. I believe the fiduciary responsibility of boards, just go beyond just compliance, and talking about strategic stewardship, right? Especially as it relates to fundraising, which, let's be honest, has become much more challenging right now.
Right. So we can list the basic obligations, the fiduciary obligations, which are duty of care, duty of loyalty, and duty of obedience. But they really translate to me into making sure that the organization has a mission and stays on mission, making sure that the organization is compliant with laws. I often say, keep the organization out of jail. That's kind of a little bit of a joke, but comply with the laws and keep the organization financially healthy. Those are the main areas that I think that the board really translates into application of those obligations. We get into some other areas like avoiding conflicts of interest, of course, and but that to me also falls under compliance as well.
Basically, or practically, this breaks down into key responsibilities, right? Like safeguarding assets, ensuring financial solvency and stability, approving budgets and monitoring financial performance, and of course, compliance with regulations and ethical standards. And now, let's tackle some misconceptions. I've heard things like, I'm just here to rubber stamp the budget, or that there's finance committee's job. I don't need to understand the details. So both are dangerous mindsets, right? But while the finance committee does delve deeper, the entire board is, ultimately responsible. Every board member needs a foundational understanding of the financial health to make informed decisions for the organization. So can you discuss more about that, Marta? Like, in the real scenario, uh, there are finance committee, audit committee, and sometimes those are both combined, and there's like business development committee and whatnot. Does that mean that if I'm not part of that committee, then I am, exempted from that obligation, from overseeing the overall, happenings, while I just need to focus on the committee that I belong to?
Well, I do think it's obviously I everybody on the board is responsible for the financial health of the organization, and if there isn't some level of I would say understanding of the financials, then hopefully the staff would help support greater and deeper
Mm,
understanding over time with the way the financials are presented and
mm,
explained, including footnotes and other types of explanations that put into real life conversation what they're seeing on the spreadsheets. Because I don't think it's reasonable to expect that anyone who goes on a board needs to be able to read financial spreadsheets and reports and audit reports, things like that. The and the finance committee, which is often two separate committees, sometimes it's combined in smaller organizations that don't have enough expertise to field two separate teams in that area. Um, they do the drill down. They do the drill down and hopefully are raising concerns with the treasurer before you actually get to the board meeting, and hopefully they're also involved in the budget review before it gets to the board for approval, and they're going to support the CFO and the ED or CEO in walking through those financials and budgets when it gets to the board vote. That would be ideal, and to work out a lot of those kinks ahead of time. And I do think, it's important to note that you want a board that has a well-rounded set of um, experiences and skills, and it doesn't need, you don't want to scare away people by thinking they need to know financials in order to be a valuable board member. But that said, I do think, of course, the board members need to understand um, the expression of the mission through the programming, which means the types of revenue that come in the door through programming and or through the development or fundraising function. So the earned revenue and the charitable revenue. And not to micromanage the staff, but to understand those streams of income and be involved in helping support them, especially on the fundraising side of it. And every board member can play a role. We'll talk about that a little more, but every board member should be part of that. The board also has responsibility as part of this financial health, if there are assets available to invest, to be prudently investing them in short and long term um, investment vehicles depending on the needs of the organization, the run rate, the strategic plan, et cetera. So that's another, and sometimes you'll have an investment committee. Sometimes you'll have the finance committee work with an outside investor or any number of combinations to help that an investment manager on the outside to help manage that. That involves also things like board restricted funds or endowments and things like that as well.
I totally agree, right? Like your board doesn't need to be made up of CPAs. But every board member should understand, the basic financials, your budget, your financial statements, your cash flow position, and funding mix, right? Are they asking the right questions, right? Do they know your months of operating reserves? Do they understand the implications of restricted versus unrestricted funding? But part of this is really also, what Marta said, that helping boards really understand the numbers, which in some ways in Scrub we help them, right? Like we help boards who are overwhelmed with spreadsheets, who are frustrated with vague summaries, And we help them by putting together digestible financial information, putting together clear dashboards, visual summaries. Again, so a lot of the people in the board are probably also coming from different backgrounds. Like they could be program people, which again, finance may not be their strongest suit. So then, we have to help them bridge that gap.
I would never want to dissuade a board member, an interested party who is otherwise a good candidate, from coming on the board because they don't have the financial expertise, because that is why you hire staff and that is why you engage a scrubbed to come in and distill the information. Now, that said, the board member should come to the board member meeting prepared, having read the materials, come with ready questions, Lawrence, like you said, but having that support of the CEO, the CFO, and the outside vendors as well is really the reality for many board members to get them there.
Thank you, Marta and Lawrence. And Lawrence, I like what you said, like, I'm sharing the story behind the numbers, but more about that later on as we tackle on the other, on topics. So basically, everyone really has to be onboarded and engaged and has their interests for the well-being of the organization. So moving beyond oversight, let's talk about the board being an active, revenue driver. Many boards focus on friend raising, which means networking and introducing people. So that's a start. But how can they move beyond simply connecting to actively contributing to diverse revenue streams?
So I'll jump in here. Certainly, this is an area that I would say often is underutilized. Sometimes that's by the fact of board resistance to the development, or I use development and fundraising the same, fundraising and development function, or it may just be that they don't know what to do, and that is often the case. So it could be resistance and discomfort. It could be not having the training to know what to do. So some of the things I think to first look at um, is has the organization assessed the board's fundraising capability? What is the experience of the board members who are currently on the board? And have they ever been in this position where they're being asked to share their contacts, to do outreach, to be ambassadors in a way that leads to financial support, not only fundraising, to your point, James? Um, and then once you have a sense of the strength of those on the board right now and the comfort level, and this all comes from management. To me, this is managing up to the board. I think it's the unusual board that on its own moves forward with development and fundraising, with the exception of highly motivated early boards that are really working boards, getting an organization off the ground. But once you're into your general board mode of governance, I think that the impetus and the kind of the engine behind the fundraising activity needs to come from management, that and development staff, if there are separate staff for that purpose, as you grow. So helping the board by giving training to the board periodically so they understand their role in fundraising. They get help developing what we call pitch development, or ask, like, how do they put in language that's comfortable for them why this organization is important to them, why they support it, and why they would hope you would also become interested in supporting it. And then strategies and tactics, which again are really come with partnering from the staff and or using an outside consultant. Dunleavy does this with the firm I'm with, does this with a lot of the organizations that we serve. We work with the fundraising staff and the board to help them understand strategies and tactics that are very specific to the particular potential donor. You want to understand their affinity to give, their propensity, their capacity. You want to know what dollars they even might have available to support the organization, should they have the affinity and propensity to give to the organization. And I think what's really critical is setting clear goals and timelines, working with the board to give to-dos with accountability, because the board is they're all volunteers. They have many, most have other jobs, they have families, they have other responsibilities. And if you don't ask for specifics and reach agreement that this is doable, that these are actionable and achievable, then you really just are giving them training, and they just go off and say, okay, I learned something, but they don't have anything to do as a result, or they won't do it on their own. So that is, I think, really the key. And then we can also talk about the role specifically of a development committee to the extent you have one on the board.
I have a question for Lawrence. Working with different nonprofits and directly with, executive directors, CFOs, controllers, and whatnot, and sometimes directly with the board members as well. So, how, coming from finance perspective, how do we help, the board members diversify their revenue models for their nonprofit sustainability? Like, there are like grant opportunities, individual donor engagement, corporate partnerships, and earn income.
I think first off, it's something that we have seen in a lot of organization. Too many boards think fundraising belongs exclusively to the staff. Well, the IRS doesn't make that distinction, so neither should we. And ultimately, fundraising is a fiduciary issue, right? Because without revenue, without money, then there's no mission for the organization. We've talked about, it's really a it's work together between the board and the executive management team, right? To me, there's a few things that we have seen that's effective for some of the organizations that we work with in helping the board get to that level where they are fundraising more effectively, right? First is developing briefing kits for board members before donor meetings. That includes some like talking points, some donor history, some giving patterns, like really analyzing what the current revenue structure of the organization is. Like, where do we get most of our donations? Are they coming in from foundations? Do we have like regular donors that give multi-year grants or that give, out of like a family foundation that they have? Those are very important information to have, because then part of the responsibility of a board member would also to continue to cultivate those relationships. Are we seeing certain giving patterns from coming from like a certain group of people? Then those could also be, like very specific groups that we can continue to nurture the relationship with, right? Another thing is that, fundraising has to always be part of the conversation, and it should always be part, of the agenda at every board meeting, not just at the end of the year update where we're trying to see where we need to come up for more funds or where we're trying to run a deficit. How are we going to, fill that gap? Next, like Marta already said this one, it's we have to set clear expectations and not just provide coaching, right? Like many, I do believe like many board members want to help, but first they don't know how, and they don't know how to measure that, right? So hosting like short training sessions or pairing them with probably experienced fundraisers, like the responsibility of them not just going alone, but probably going together with expert fundraisers within the organizations could be like a good starting point. If they have like a connection that they know that they can introduce the organization, they don't have to do that conversation alone. They can actually bring someone from the organization with them, right? And I think this is the last one that I have is sharing success stories and data so the board can confidently articulate the organization's impact and case for support. And again, this should not just be like part of the year end report. This should be like a continuous conversation within the organization.
Right, Lauren. So I'd like to link what Marta said earlier about setting clear fundraising goals and expectations. And for example, I'm a board member and I have a wide network and influence with different people that could help me and the organization meet the financial goals and sustainability in terms of having diverse revenue streams. So, Marta, how can we encourage these board members, or even have an eye opener that they would realize I have this great potential of network that could help me, and that maybe that's the reason why I'm sitting at this board, so that I could connect my influence and the goal of my nonprofit.
Right, right. And I agree with what Lawrence was saying about how there essentially there's a role for every board member in the fundraising process. And if everyone has a network of some sort, it's figuring out who in that network might be a good fit for and ask. And the particular board member does not have to have experience in that, to both of your points, or have done it before. In fact, it's preferred that they not be asked to do a solicitation until there's a readiness. You cultivate the donor, which can be, would you be willing to go to coffee with me and the executive director? I just want to introduce you to what this organization does, because it's very important to me. And I think if it's important to me, you might be interested in it. And then you build from there. And even when between the staff and the whoever's the relationship manager, which may be on the staff, maybe a board member, between them, everyone says, you know what, we're ready to do an ask. We're in a campaign or what have you. We've been cultivating this person. We've invited them to events. We've talked to them about, we've shown them the programming, inviting them into the field, depending on what the work is. We're now ready for the solicitation. Um, it doesn't need to come from the board member. The board member can attend. Maybe at that point they don't even need to attend, or they don't want to attend. It can be handled by either another board member and or the staff. So it shouldn't be something that creates anxiety. That we would never want that. It should be something that feels like it's growing properly. That's why it's called development. It doesn't happen overnight. It's about relationship building and then distilling out who is a potential donor for the organization. And then you get into all different other things about like what kind of gift they might give in terms of size or type, like appreciated stock. Is there a planned giving opportunity? Are there is there family foundation or DAFs? Then you get into all that, but that all comes along the way, um, as you build that relationship with the individual that you think might be a good fit for this organization. And the goal is to find people who are going to be long term. It's an investment of everyone's time, including the donors, but the staff and the board. So you want to try to find people that would be interested in longer term relationships with the organization and get joy. The donor gets joy from connecting with a mission that is meaningful to them. And if they have the capacity to give, it should in the end feel like a wonderful partnership, not an uncomfortable request.
And that's a very great point, Marta. It's not about being a professional fundraiser. So you just have to have that passion for the mission and ask for support. So you just also need to be equipped, and so that you'll be ready to feel confident and comfortable in soliciting funds effectively. So what also Lawrence mentioned earlier about joining a group, and Marta, about just witnessing, observing it, and it doesn't take overnight. It needs to be developed, and even if you're already has the experience and expertise, you also need to continuously develop that and make sure you are as effective as you can as part of the board. So in talking about equipping your board, so there are strategies for engagement and literacy. How do executive directors and CFOs actually equip and empower their boards in financial discussions? I believe this is where managing up comes in, right?
I don't know if it would be a good time to talk a little bit about the board's role in working with the management on a development plan and how the CFO also is involved in that. And Lawrence, I don't want to step into your territory if you'd rather drive that, but I thought maybe we could talk about that a little bit.
I think, like before we move on, I think like the last part that we were talking about, I would think, we are talking directly to the development professionals out there, right? They play a critical role in bridging the board staff gap. Uh, James said we don't need professional board fundraisers, right? We need them to be confident, consistent, and committed advocates of the organization. So, to the development people, professionals out there, we have to help our board make it easy for the board to engage. Let's educate them through storytelling, and then it's a continuous building of a culture of partnership. I think that's how, we make this successful. And, shifting into the topic of the role of a CFO, I think, Martha, I of course, like, we have a lot to share about it, but I would be interested to hear first, like from somebody, like from your perspective, how does that play out? Also with what you have seen with a lot of the organizations you work with.
Yeah. So circling back a little bit to what James was talking about earlier with the CFO educating the board, and Lawrence, you may have been touching on that as well. I think first of all, whether there's a development committee or the board as a whole does this, one of the fiduciary responsibilities, I believe, is to work with management to create a development plan each year. It's a plan that says it can be something like, this harkens back to, I think, James, where you were going earlier. X percentage of our funds will come from grants. Our goals for the year. Y will come from major gifts. This amount will come from pipeline donors. This amount from events, et cetera. Whatever's your array of the portfolio of giving that you have. And I'm just talking about charitable revenue right now, not the earned revenue piece. So the CFO and the executive leader can really help the board understand through education what is the mix of how we get there. And then each year, if it's the development staff working with the CEO and the CFO, or if it's working with the development committee as well, if there is a development committee, hopefully there is, that's always a good thing. Um, Coming up with your development plan for the year, which is really your goals for the mix and how you're going to get there. It doesn't mean that the board members are getting into the minutia of how many gifts at what level. That's not what we're talking about necessarily, but it's the mix of how you're going to get there for the year, so that you have some goals and can measure against what the plan was, and also understand if you're not hitting certain goals, why, and if you're exceeding certain goals. And I think, James, you were talking about this earlier, that there might be certain areas where you're really, really tied in well with that revenue stream that maybe you're not activating as aggressively as you might. So when you look at your development plan and measure against what you thought you were going to be doing, you'll see where there are opportunities that might be left on the table, or areas that are starting to become a little more challenging. So just for an example, if you have a nonprofit that's been heavily, heavily dependent on government grants right now in the United States, we know that's a risky model if you're not also fleshing it out with diversified sources, right? So a lot of organizations are scrambling a little bit to figure out what are their opportunities in the other charitable revenue spaces that they could shore up, or go after different types of grants than they've been relying on in the past to explore new opportunities. So that would go into your development funding, your development plan for this year, because you want to minimize the risk based on the changing political climate.
That's right on Marta. And so, you know, those are some um, effective ways to help the board engage and prepare and fundraising. So another thing that we could equip them. So I'm going back to my next next line topic in terms of equipping our board. So now we've talked about the fundraising, their networks, them getting ready, and also how do we help our board get literate in a sense, to have a better understanding of the financial performance of their nonprofit. So Lawrence mentioned earlier that you don't have to be a CPA to 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 understand the numbers, but at least the CFO, the controller, and everyone who are down the line could help them understand what's happening. Are we sustainable? Are we still going to operate in the next year, 5 years? What do we need to do? So I believe this is where managing up in terms of you being a finance or part of the finance department to help your board. So, what are the practical tips for leaders to effectively communicate financial needs and opportunities to the board?
There's such an array of capacity on the part of the nonprofits of what they even can do. There are nonprofits where the executive director is literally doing the QuickBooks, right? And then they grow and maybe they get a bookkeeper and then they grow and they get a controller but to get to the CFO level where you can actually expect projections and cash flow reports and look backs and stuff. I think that is getting to a more sophisticated business model, and many, many, many nonprofits cannot do that on their own. But that's where a scrub comes in or some outside support, I think, it doesn't have to be for every board meeting, but gosh, at least once a year, if not more, at least getting ready for budget season, to get a little more sophisticated drill down into how you're doing so there aren't surprises. We're working with an organization right now that has had a real surprise where they thought they had endowment assets to last them for the next 3 to 4 years of operating needs, and they've now realized this is the year. This is the year. They only have 1 year left, so they have to decide what that looks like. Are they going to expand revenue dramatically, and how would that happen? Are they gonna look at merger partners? Are they going to wind down and dissolve, because maybe someone else in the space can pick up that work? So these are things that are happening. I think these are conversations happening across the country now, in light of the changing funding environment, I would say.
Yes, and I would add, right, like to me, the first and foremost, the CFO's role is to, or even the controller's role is to always demystify the numbers for the boards, right? It that includes presenting clear and consistent financial information, and you can only do that if you have, like the proper support in your finance team. And it can even go beyond, doing finance 101, right? Like, or connecting it directly, finance 101 for fundraising workshop for board members, helping them interpret development reports and understand how donor dollars move, through the organization. How does a donation move from being restricted to unrestricted? When can we actually spend, it's like certain dollars, it doesn't always mean we have the money, then we can spend the money, which is a very important concept in the nonprofit world, right? It's important for the CFO to continue linking finance and fundraising, creating visual reports that how the development performance is, like donor retention rates, campaign ROIs, restricted funding use, how all of this ties to the overall financial health of the organization. It always helps to create this visual representations, because some of the boards, again, they're not finance people, and some of them could be very visual, and putting it together in the visual presentation really helps them see through it. The other thing is I would say is, it's being able to forecast revenue gaps clearly, giving that clear picture of uh putting together like different scenarios. One of the things that we have seen, in action before is a CFO presented three scenario forecasts, during a board strategic retreat. One based on flat giving, one on modest growth, and one assuming like a 15% drop. That visual sort of like made the urgency and the opportunity very real. And, it sparked something within the board members to understand, if we stay the same course, if we grow this much, if one assumption changes, how does this all of us, how does this affect the organization as a whole? And then what can we do to make sure that we are on track with whatever what we're trying to achieve? And of course, that involves, really a strategic partnership, continuous strategic partnership with the development team, right? It's important to understand that in a nonprofit organization, it's important that people do not, work in silos. CFOs should always collaborate with the fundraisers to build shared reports and speak with a unified voice, what the numbers actually mean. And I think lastly, it's, connecting all the dots and tying it all up to sustainability, right? Like use financial modeling to show the implications of different fundraising scenarios. What happens to mission if giving drops by 10% or if donor retention improves by 5%. So these are compelling planning tools that help boards make informed and very proactive decisions.
I agree with that. The concept you raised of the understanding of risk restricted versus unrestricted is one that really trips up the board and actually sometimes staff as well. Sometimes we've gone in and done training on that for staff as well because it impacts their understanding of their programmatic budgets. So especially if the organization is heavily grant funded, even in the best of environments where you're not having your contracts canceled after the fact, etc. Um, you have the situation of the grant allocation and the timing of the dollars coming in that don't always marry up with the best intentions to hit payroll for the staff that you've hired to deliver on the programming that the grant supports. So it can get really tricky. And sometimes the board may not understand that on an accrual basis, to your point, Lawrence, the financials look really healthy, but the cash is really desperate. We can't make payroll because the governmental payments were delayed or something like that. Or our report was delayed, so the grantor, the funder didn't release the funds at the time, but it was delayed because we had, people out due to COVID or whatever happens, things happen. So understanding that is really critical.
Marta, you also mentioned about like government funds, right? So I think it's important, again, not just the idea of restricted versus unrestricted, but, the different kinds of revenue that we have. And, for some organizations that are very heavily reliant on government funding, we know that government grants work on the reimbursable model. So basically, the organization is already fronting a lot of those expenses, and if they're not able to invoice on time, invoice properly, making sure that, the government does not send them back their invoice, multiple times, for them to get first is accepted before they even get paid, right? So one organization that we work with, like more than 50% of their funding comes from the government. And without even realizing, they've been spending on their line of credit because they have 3 months worth of invoices to the government that has not been billed and they have not been able to collect. So it's very important, for someone sitting on the board to also understand that, take a look at, how are we diversifying our revenue? And if we have like a huge chunk of that coming from the government, what is our turnaround time in terms of, getting all of that invoice and getting, all of our receivables from the government paid, right? Because that's always money that's tied and we're not able to use for the mission.
So since you raised that, I want to tie that back also into the board understanding of operations and capacity needs because both with that's an example where sometimes the invoices aren't getting out timely because there isn't enough capacity in the finance department, or on the programmatic side where they're doing the reporting up to do it accurately and timely, or the systems may not be in place. We've worked with clients where there's very complicated calculations of the percentages of certain types of operating expenses and salaries and that apply to one grant versus another. So it's not simply sending out a bill. There's work to be done to meet the grant parameters in order to issue the bill. And that goes also to development where, having the board understand what it takes in terms of creating that engine, that support of development expertise and the analysis that you were talking about earlier, working with the CFO and the development folks to be able to look at the trends, the retention, the lapsed donors, et cetera, and what's your ROI on certain types of things like events or what have you. That all takes time and effort from staff. So when it comes to the budget, it's all hand in glove, right? If the board is very loath to expand the operating um, budget so that you can hire people or invest in systems that are going to have long-term benefit, then they're you're gonna it's a catch-22, right? The people are human. They can only get done so much work, and some of this is pretty complicated. So, that's something we talk about with boards a lot that, because there's certain ratios they wanna stick with in terms of programmatic versus fundraising versus, administration, and sometimes that functional allocation among those 3 categories can also be finessed a little bit to make the numbers look a little better if attention is paid to the details of how the dollars are being spent. So I don't wanna get too much in the weeds on that except to say that, I think having boards understand that, overhead and the funders too, understand that overhead is not a bad word. It's an essential part of the capacity to deliver on the mission through all of these functions.
Right, Marta, and thank you as well, Lawrence, for that. So maybe
Mhm.
in summary, the practical tips would be to be proactive. Don't wait for problems. Share regular, clear financial updates, and even when things are going well or are not going well. And second one would be to simplify. You can use visuals, dashboards, executive summaries, not just the common financial statements. And also, lastly, contextualize, which means we have to make sense of the numbers, why the numbers are they are. And so, definitely enhancing financial literacy among board members is paramount. And maybe finally, don't shy away from leveraging external expertise. When and why can a third party consultant be invaluable for a board member or for board development and accountability in financial matters, right? So sometimes an outside voice can explain complex concepts in a fresh way, provide unbiased assessments, or train board members or fundraising techniques without internal pressures. It can be wise investment for long-term board effectiveness. And let's quickly touch on some real world scenarios. I've heard from NPOs struggling with board members who just don't engage financially or boards that are hesitant to ask for money.
Right. So board members that don't donate and you need the 100% participation um, for a lot of grants, right? They ask that. Do you have 100% participation of board giving each year? So if you can't say yes, that's not a good look. And then of course they ask, which is it's scary for a lot of people, or they want to make sure they feel confident in the process. So um, how do you get around that? One thing is, I think, making sure that you have clear written board expectations um, that drive the person's decision of whether to get involved in the organization as a board member, whether that is a give or get requirement, or a give to, everyone has to give to a means that's within their means, an amount that's within their means. Um, and what type of participation in terms of board uh, attendance, event attendance, or other ways you're expected to use your expertise. To me, it should be written, and then there should be a process of board assessment periodically, if not every year, then every other year or third year, where you're not only looking at the board, you're not only evaluating how's the board doing as a whole, but each member is evaluated or does a self assessment, just like you evaluate your CEO. These are fiduciary obligations. So look at that and have candid conversations if someone is not able to participate meaningfully, including in that revenue function, whether it be the financials or whether it be opening their contact list to make sure that we can assess if there might be some real potential there to support the organization, because that's one of the reasons you're on the board. So I think that is part of it, to be really clear and take those steps to do that. That can also help you evaluate whether you're missing certain types of capacities on your board, and that can inform your nominating committee or others of what kinds of skill sets you should be looking for to help round out the board. Um, I think also looking at your committee structure to make sure that you do have a finance committee, you do have a development committee at a minimum. They're much more important to me than a marketing committee, right? Marketing is important, but really, let's keep the organization healthy and on track financially. So I hope I answered that. I went a little bit off on a tangent there just to get into board mechanics, but um, and then you were asking about how to motivate board members if they're not participating in that way. I go back to, again, like, give them the tools, because it's really easy for management to point to the board and say, oh, we just don't have a board that's motivated. They say they're going to do things, but they don't. And we told them, please go out and fundraise for us. Just go out and fundraise for us. What does that mean? That means very different things to different organizations. And what tools are you giving them to feel confident, to Lawrence's point earlier, and to be accountable? What are you asking of them? And are you helping them be able to achieve that? So we have to look at ourselves as the consultants and as the staff who are hired to be the subject matter experts to support these volunteer boards so that they can fulfill those fiduciary responsibilities.
Yes. So, I would just like to add, how do we re-engage a financially passive board? I think the first and foremost is, we have to reframe the ask, you know. So instead of saying, hey, you need to fundraise, you need to go out there and fundraise. I think, we have to shift the mindset, right? It's should be about stewardship and not just solicitation. So, frame it like, as a board member, your role, your responsibility is to ensure that the mission is sustainable. And that includes understanding how we generate and use our resources. So then, it doesn't become sort of like a task that they need to fulfill, but it's still part of the mission that they believe in within the organization. The other thing, Marta talked about this somehow is, let's break down the roles of, what we want our board members to be out there. They could be, some examples of these roles could be, they could be advocates, right? Like they could invite friends or relatives or connections to a mission event. And, that's a way for these people to start to getting to know more about what the organization does. Board members could be storytellers. They could share testimonials on the social media through LinkedIn. They could be connectors, introducing potential donors or corporate partners. They could even be, like good stewards. They could do actual thank you letters or join donor calls. And, lastly, for someone who had, a little bit more advanced in terms of like experience, they could be real advisors, like provide feedback on funding strategy or budget planning. If we clearly define roles and we actually have like a good understanding of our board composition, what their strengths are, we can actually assign them these roles and then make those specific ask of what we want them, to actually do and where we want them to contribute in. And I think Marta started on this one too. Is if all else fails, what do we do? I think it's time to revisit, the composition. It's all about really structuring and putting together the right policies. Again, not just to make corrective actions, but to really protect the organization, in the long term. If there is a board, if a board has like a systemic resistance to financial engagement and it's really limiting the organization's potential, it might be time to first is adjust the recruitment priorities, right? Like seek people with the specific backgrounds that you need, background that you think is relevant and is missing within your current board composition. And really defining that, like what is really your board composition going to look like. Next is, add board training as part of the onboarding. And this is where clear setting of expectations could also be discussed. And lastly is, you know, consider term limits or advisory committees as like soft exits for disengaged members. Again, this is when everything else fails, but it's always good to have this structure in place because then what do you do when you are already in that situation? It's the execution would be easier if you have these policies in place.
I love that you raised all those issues. Thank you so much. That was a great summary of the bigger strategy for good board governance. And when we do board trading, that's often something we'll talk about because you do want the mechanisms in place for the good and the less good. If it's just not working out, it can be a real inhibitor to the organization if you're not able to develop the board further. And sometimes that means gently moving people along, unfortunately. I also love that you brought up the stewardship, which is so critical. And it's such a great way for board members to get their toe in the water in the development landscape of being assigned a bunch of thank yous, phone calls or emails. And it's really touching when donors do receive a phone call directly from the board member. And, the staff or an outside consultant, we often help write the scripts a little bit. We don't expect you to know exactly what to say. We'll help you with that pitch, that communication as well. But it's a lovely way for people to get involved in that and the storytelling. Why is this important to me? Well, guess what I saw when I was out at this program and I saw the impact it had. Those impact stories are great. So thank you for raising them.
All right. So I know there's a lot of things you still want to share, but given the limitation of time, maybe just for a final point, any call to action for executive directors, CFOs, and any financial leaders in maybe, just to summarize everything we've talked about, what's your call to action, Marna and Lawrence?
Yeah, I'll jump in here. I think, first of all, I think this can all feel very overwhelming. Well, we have to do this now. We have to do that. There's so much to do. But I would say make a list and and then prioritize it and put together the goals that are bite size, a bit at a time. When you talk to an outside consultant, they often will help you prioritize what do we think is most important based on what we're hearing that you're experiencing. And then I also think it's really important to socialize these concepts with your board. Don't assume they understand what you're talking about or the language you're using. A bit at a time, get them used to hearing this language and help them understand what it means so that it becomes part of their lexicon and their understanding of their board roles. And then lastly, budget for outside support. That is something that often is not done, and then it's an urgent situation where they say, "Oh, I need to hire scrub to do all this financial analysis." We don't have it in the budget. "Oh my gosh, we need strategic planning or development support or um, an organizational assessment from Dunleavy," or whatever it is. We do a lot of different things. we don't have a budget. So think ahead, because outside support, that's that outside expertise that may be short term. Sometimes it's not a long term thing, sometimes it is. But make sure you're thinking about that. It costs some money, or I mean, it's a lot cheaper than hiring an FTE that you don't need for the long term, right? So think about that.
Okay. I think for me, just in summary, if you are part of the management, if you are an ED or a CFO, you're a business development officer listening right now, your role is to make the board's involvement in fundraising easier, more strategic, and more effective. If you're on the board, ask for support, ask for data, ask for tools, ask for clarity. Because, at the end of the day, a board that fundraises well, to me, isn't just doing more, it's actually doing better.
All right. So thank you, Marta and Lawrence. So to recap, the board's role is absolutely essential in the NPO's financial journey, from rigorous oversight and ensuring compliance to actively, driving diverse revenue streams and fostering financial literacy among all members. It's a multifaceted but incredibly rewarding responsibility. Maybe my call to action for everyone would be take that one tangible step to improve your board's financial engagement. Maybe sending out a simplified financial dashboard, scheduling a quick 15-minute training session on a key financial metric, or having a one-on-one conversation with a board member about their network. So whatever that is, take that step. And for more resources, you can visit our website at scrub.net. So that's SERUBBED.net. And you could also reach out to Marta. I'm sure she's gonna accommodate a lot of your questions and help you get started with what you have heard from us. So thank you for tuning in today. Your dedication to your mission is what makes the nonprofit world so vital. Until next time, keep those bottom lines strong and keep making an impact. Thank you.